Hi, welcome to episode 21 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you enjoy listening, please subscribe on whatever platform you're using, give us a like in this particular episode, and check us out on Instagram at American Tributaries. Today, I'm so very delighted to be joined by John Dennis. John is a folk musician living in Nashville, Tennessee, and John and I connected when I heard a song that he had written, Bird of Freedom, for a Braver Angels songwriting contest back in 2020. And it was a song that I just found just beautiful and hopeful and aching and timeless and transcendent and, 100 other adjectives. So I thought it was a good excuse to reach out to him out of the blue and see if I could learn more about the song, more about him, more about music and Nashville and the state of Tennessee. So John, we've got a lot to pack in the next hour or so. But
definitely,
thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I've tuned into your episode since you reached out, and I think what you're doing is a wonderful thing, and it's an honor to get to be a part of it. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that, even responding to my initial outreach, because I realize how random those are. But I just figure if we're going to try to build new bridges in this country, we've got to go into uncharted territory. So a random guy from Brooklyn reaching out to a random guy in Nashville seemed to be the way to go. So
how it's done.
So how long have you been a musician?
So I actually started playing music in fourth grade. I played saxophone in the school band. I grew up in like a small Illinois farm town type place. And I joined the band just because my friends were doing it. So I never was a super musical person growing up. My first love was baseball. I always wanted to be a baseball player, but as I got older, the more I realized I just wasn't a very good baseball player. And then in eighth grade, I got cut from the grade school baseball team. So I was heartbroken, and my parents and I went to a Borders bookstore. And for whatever reason in that moment, I decided to buy one of the Beatles' greatest hits compilations at the store. And so we listened to it on the drive home, and my parents were singing along, and there was just this magic to it for me. And so I told them I need to have a guitar. I've got to play the guitar. And so we went to a music store, and I bought, kind of a beginner electric guitar, and it started from there. So that would have been when I was 13. So 17 years of guitar playing for me.
Wow. And did you take lessons, or is it more self-taught or a mix?
It was a mix. It started out self-taught. It was one of those things for me where I couldn't put it down. I mean, that was all I thought about was this, getting home to play the guitar, getting home to practice. And my older brother actually sat me down at one moment early on and just said, okay, well, if you're going to play the guitar, here's 20 records that you have to listen to because you have to be informed about what you're doing. And it was everything from, Sticky Fingers, Rolling Stones, to the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Pearl Jam, all of these great records, Zeppelin, of course. And I just that's all I did was listen to this classic rock music. And then eventually a teacher at my school heard me playing and recommended that I go and learn from this guy named Steve Jackson in my hometown, who is a brilliant musician, a wonderful human being. And so I took lessons through him and did it on my own. And within a couple of years, some friends and I started the bar band thing. And so we were in high school playing 3-4 hour sets around the St. Louis area. And just kept going at it. And then eventually I ended up moving to Nashville to study guitar at Belmont in 2010. So that's been the path.
Wow. Did you and I guess when did you when did you start focusing on what kind of music you were going to write? I mean, I guess I don't know enough to be able to say with anything with authority, but I imagine everything is somewhat related. But how did you kind of start focusing on folk music and specifically?
Yeah, so kind of one of the interesting things is, and I'm 30 years old, so I've gotten to the point where I'm a little hippy dippy about the whole conversation of that. I very much subscribe now to the idea that we are going to create what we're bringing into ourselves. Like what you're listening to, what you're watching, what you're reading, that's going to end up getting into the subconscious and somehow filtering out in the creative process. But what I would say is I've always been a writer. I was a writer before I started playing music. My dad's an attorney up there, sort of forged himself in the image of Abe Lincoln, like brilliant, high integrity individual, but raised me on like the poets, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Poe, Robert Frost, all of these great writers. And so I think that was already there in the formative years. And so even when I got into the Beatles and I started to get into that rock music, it was really the lyric that was driving me. That was just it's always been what reached out and grabbed me is the poet, musician. And so if you're doing that and you're starting in kind of the 60s, 70s rock era, like inevitably you're going to find Dylan and Paul Simon and all of the, Joan Baez and Judy Collins and all of the folk movement, because that's where the lyrics are. And so that was one of those moments where like, first time I got Dylan, it's like, I don't think it made a lot of sense to me because you hear that guy's voice and you're just kind of not sure. But then you really live with those lyrics and you just realize, oh man, like this is just genius. Like this is the poet laureate of rock. That's what he introduces himself as at his shows, and he probably deserves it. But I think when I started to find those things and found kind of those major touchstone artists for me, like Tom Petty and Johnny Cash is kind of the school my parents were coming from, the classic country stuff. It just, you inevitably end up in folk music. And so from there, that's kind of been my thing, the acoustic singer-songwriter thing that sort of blossomed into other genres and other considerations. But I would say fairly early on, I ended up there.
Wow. It's I come from like my initial profession. I was in the Navy, but I was also a lawyer for 8 years. And one of the things that when I moved on to another career after that is like, lawyers are very hyper rational and you can put words on paper. Right. And I think, but there's so much more to communicating with people than just like the words on paper. And that's one of the things that I think that's lost in people when we're talking about like kind of civic issues, is that people are not and have never been and never will be just hyper rational. They're also communicated to with feelings. And I find like, putting something on a piece of paper and just writing things verbatim is not really the only way to communicate people. You can communicate with like poetry, or you can communicate, like you said, with music and tug at the heartstrings and move people in ways that just mere words can't do. So it's fascinating to hear. It's like almost like as a musician, you're almost talking like in an added dimension.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I've always been somebody who finds like the idea that you can hear an instrumental piece of music and have it be emotionally moving to you fascinating. Like it has to do with tension and release and the way sound is working together. And so I've really my progression as a writer has gone from that kind of simple folk song where the lyric is really where the whole thing is, to really allowing the lyric to kind of be dressed up by sort of the more nuanced music and the arrangement. But it is fascinating. It makes me think, because I know you're a writer. I was reading, I don't even remember what it was, where it was being read. It may have been Stephen King's own writing or Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, one of those. But they were talking about Jack London as a writer. And they said Jack London started out just verbatim writing Rudyard Kipling like stories, like word by word, just writing and writing over and over and over again until eventually he decided to take that step and say, I'm going to write my own thing. And I thought, wow, that is such an interesting kind of analog for what it looks like, because I think about my life and I'll meet people in Nashville who their whole dream is I'm going to sing original music. This is going to be me. I'm going to be Taylor Swift, or I'm going to be Tom Petty or John Prine. And but they will refuse to play cover songs. Absolutely. I'm not going to sink to that point. But some of the best musicians I know, and I know many great musicians who are that way, but I think of my life and some of the great musicians I know, and it's like those bar gigs that were 4 hours of playing other people's music, like, and adapting to a crowd that, who knows what you're going to get in a bar. That is the stuff that really built me as a writer. Like learning, like, oh, this is why "Won't Back Down" works as a song. Because if I just write the lyrics to "Won't Back Down" on a page, as you're saying, like, who knows? Like, I think it would be moving, but there's something about that delivery and its arrangement and, the way it hits people in this core without being so hyper descriptive that it loses the ability to be molded within the listener, to the personal experience. But it really is fascinating, I think, the that whole kind of like transcendence that takes place between the writer and the audience, and sort of where the pathos is coming from.
Yeah, it's and when I'm doing my writing, which is certainly not like anywhere close to your level of what you're doing, but I guess I would call it an art form with quotation marks. Is to me at least, I'm usually pushed to write because it's more like something I have to like kind of articulate. As an artist, are you only writing when it's like something you have to articulate, or do you kind of just is it more like, I don't know if laborious is the right word, but kind of more like, okay, I've got to write something today. Let me see what comes. Like, let me force myself to come up with something.
I wish that I was a little more of the latter, because I a long time ago learned like something is always better than nothing when it comes to writing. Like, but I'm such a kind of perfectionist with the way that I write that, and everyone does it differently. I know people who like their thing is they will just write pages and pages, and then if two of the lines in it are good, then it was worth it, right? And I think that's wonderful. I think that's such a valuable thing to do, because I do think that the writing muscle and the creative muscle is a muscle. It needs to be worked. It needs to be strengthened and trained. But, for me, I tend to be somebody who, when I sit down, I know pretty quickly whether or not what I'm doing is going to be a keeper. And so I tend to discard like as soon as it happens. But more recently, like I'm due to start a new record, and so I'm in this place of creation again after COVID and after like this huge downtime, where we all had to kind of reconsider and reevaluate. And so now I'm more in that place of like, John, you need to sit down and like just put yourself in a creative place, and then allow that muse or whatever to work on you, if it's time. I do have a bit of that kind of mysticism when it comes to creativity, and believing like, well, I'm trying to think, it may have been Arlo Guthrie. It was, somebody had a quote that was like, when you're writing songs, you're always fishing downriver from someone. You just have to be careful not to be fishing downriver from Dylan, because he catches all of the fish upstream. Like, and so really it's kind of that idea of like the songs are all kind of out there already, which is, mystic, but like if you don't grab it, if that thing works on you and you don't take what's being given to you in that inspiration, like it can become lost. And I have to try to take that as seriously as I can, I think.
Yeah. Wow. Are you able to play a little bit of that song, the Bird of Freedom song?
Sure, I can.
And maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So this tune, as I told you on the phone, like it was born out of a songwriting competition that took place with Braver Angels in 2020. And so kind of the prompt of the song was just a song of unity, right? And because as I recall, like in that moment, it was a very tumultuous moment in our country. I think we were witnessing a lot of the BLM stuff and, the post-George Floyd events. And so I think for me, when that competition prompt rolled around, it just felt like kind of a moment in which I felt like I could maybe put something into words, and feel justified in doing so. Without getting too much into that, it was just sort of, I think a lot of us felt kind of that helpless, like, I want to do something. I want to feel like I can speak, but I don't really know what to say, and I don't know whether or not I should be saying anything at all. And so this prompt had come along, and they were asking for sort of a song of unity, and it was being judged by one of the judges was Peter Yarrow from Peter, Paul, and Mary, who's a hero of mine, of the folk scene. And so I kind of just approached it like I would a 60s folk song, like that kind of, I was pandering a little bit to his style, but I was pleased with it, but it's a tune that it's not really a subject matter that I think I normally approach, and I just kind of went with it, but I'll play a little bit of it.
Great, thank you.
Oh God, are you still listening? The cries, they must be deafening. From Gettysburg to old Saigon, from Birmingham to Ferguson, in the blood of honest Abraham, in free at last, and yes we can. Behold the roaring song of change, swing wide the door to freedom's cage. Oh my, I heard that great bird sing, and she did not run for cover, for creation does destruction bring, though it be not judgment's thunder, but the beating of the wings. So that was a verse and a chorus, but
yeah, it really is every time I hear it, it seems just soaring. And I don't know if I'm capturing it correctly, but I do find both like an achingness, but a hopefulness, like a resolute hopefulness amongst the ache. I don't know if that's what you were trying to do, but it's almost palpable.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a song that's really meaningful to me. And in the video, like I have this kind of talk intro that I had written, which is very like old folk styling. But, I was reading back through that because you had messaged me last night to say, hey, could you play a bit of this? And I was like, oh, I haven't played that song since really the competition. And so it's what's wonderful about art, and you probably experience this too, is like once something's created, like it remains created. And so when I get to go back and revisit these songs, like it always hits me differently because I've suddenly become the listener again. And I was listening to that intro, and there's kind of this line that like, it's something along the lines of like, we might say that it's about 200, this bird is 250 years old or whatever, but it's a lot older than that. Like it's been existing in the hearts of men and women and human beings since the beginning. And so I thought like that really hit me well because it was sort of, I think when I can feel like I'm like honing in on like those root principles of love and compassion and like the human desire for happiness and peace and safety and contentment, like, and see the American struggle in the context of what is the larger human narrative, like it feels a little bit more like, okay, maybe we're not going off the rails in this moment. Like maybe it's just this constant march towards that realization. And so there is an ache in it. But certainly it's a tune that gave me some peace in saying like, okay, there's something to this. This isn't just like this weird aside that's taking place in the history of humankind. It's a continuation. And, and it mentions Maya Angelou, Dr. Maya Angelou, who's a hero of mine. I got to see her speak at Belmont years ago, and it was one of the thrills of my life. And of course, it later mentions Dr. King and some of these great, visionary thinkers. But like even in that line, I talk about Dr. King as having an ancient dream. And so like that ancient element, like really gave me this feeling of, these were people who were tapping into the deepest parts of what human desire and need and a much less superficial freedom, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah. if you listen to the I Have a Dream, if you really look at it, it is one of the most. I mean, it's a poem. I mean, really, right? I mean, it's poetry, and it has that same actually spirit of like ache, but like resolute belief and hope, and like the fact that his dream can be realized. And it's when I listen to it, I get choked up, but much like I get choked up to listening to your song. But I think that's one of the things that can get lost, is that the dream wasn't. It was really almost like the dream wasn't for him, and it really wasn't for Black people. It was more just for like the country in a whole, was about kind of coming together. It's good for everybody, and I think that, you know, even in this day and age too, it's that. And I think it's in some respects more complicated, because it's not just race anymore, because it's beliefs, it's regional, it's political, and you know, we're dealing with that. What I liked about your song, and I don't know if this ties to religion, but when you refer to the listeners like children, in some respects, it's like kind of like somebody stepping back and kind of being like, you know, it's going to be okay. Like, this is like, we're going to get there. And here's like kind of my like beacon to get us there. And when I talk to people, I try at least think of how I see things and why they are what they are. And I realize I don't know, the hopelessness that people might be feeling, but I do, on the other hand, have like to me, an irresolute hope, and I see the possibility here as well. So like I'm not saying I'm trying to take your shoes, but I feel like there's a little bit of like people are almost looking for that beacon. And I was wondering, because we had talked a little bit about religion before with you too, is there kind of an overlap between the persona or the approach that you're taking in presenting that song, and kind of like religiosity in a more general sense of like why you have like a father, and why you have, you know, and then you have a priest talking to people as kind of like, I guess, the shepherd, like saying, you guys don't necessarily know all that's going on. Here's the path forward.
Yeah, I think certainly. And I love that take. It feels true to me. It's so part of it is like the children language. I think in some ways I'm borrowing from Dylan. You know, times they are changing, gather around children wherever you roam, like that kind of folk ideal. But, you know, you'll notice that most of the verses start with this kind of plea to God. Like, it's, oh God, are you still listening? Like, and I think what I was feeling in that moment, and probably most moments, is this need for like, where is the guiding principle? You know, where is the guiding ideal, like that you're talking about? And certainly I was raised Methodist. You know, I work in a church during the week. And like, so I very much subscribe to a lot of the Christian doctrine, and I'm a very spiritual person. And I think the Jesus message and what that character embodies, like, is a wonderful guiding principle for me. I personally am somebody who also feels that the spiritual search and even the secular search for meaning is a personal one. I think it can take on all different shapes and sizes. I'm fascinated by like the monomyth stuff of Joseph Campbell, all these different kind of like religion as a mask for the unknown, the infinite, and cultures develop these in a way that is compatible with their cultural identity. But that being said, I think like the Christian system that I was raised in, like, very much still serves me if I'm willing to allow it to speak to me, rather me forge it in whatever image I need it to be forged into. And so in terms of whether or not this song and kind of this children, the use of the term children is speaking to kind of a religiosity that I subscribe to, I would say, yeah, it does. But really, the idea of children, like it says to me, like, you know, what we have to be in every moment is teachable. Like, that's the answer. That we're, in my personal experience, when I've gotten into hairy situations and really into these deep depressions, it's because I feel as though I've thought my way into the end, and like what I found there was hopelessness. You know, it's fascinating. Like, you know, this is going to be kind of an odd statement, but like, I've always felt like certain lessons come up in my life, like at different times. Like, I'll start to get bombarded in all these different settings by this same principle or philosophy showing up, and you've done it already. And like 2 nights ago, I was sitting with a friend and talking around a fire, and she sent me a podcast on Stoicism. And it's like we had this long conversation about like where rationality ends and where kind of that deeper spiritual or emotional or revelatory, whatever you want to call it, spot begins. And so like, and you said it earlier where you're like, you can write these words on a piece of paper. It can be hyper rational, but like it doesn't have that kind of depth, that substance that is transcendent. That part is somewhere underneath it. Um, and so it's just like what I'm feeling in this moment is this almost sort of deja vu of like, there's something about the universe right now that's saying like, John, you need to take a step back and be teachable and recognize that you've become far too rational about different things. And uh,
There's a graphic that I shared on Instagram once, and it showed like a pizza. It's like a pie chart, and it showed like I think the way I think is the healthy way to look at the world, which is like one slice of pizza was how much you know, and then like two slices of pizza is how much you don't know, and then the other five, which is the majority of the pie, is what you don't even know. You don't know, and I think that if you really embrace that, I think the world becomes easier to cope with because you're always searching to learn more. And like one of the things I've been wondering is, as you learn more, is your pizza pie getting bigger, or is it, or is the circumference, or is the I guess the area of the circle just getting bigger? Like you only ever going to know 1/8 of everything, and as you learn more, you're just going to realize how much more you don't know. And I think to me that's actually the way it is that the more you know, the more you should know you don't know. And I think there's a lot of arrogance amongst a lot of people across the world, across the spectrum, across the country, where people think, I know this, I have this degree, I have that degree, I've done this, that, therefore I know. And there isn't enough humility to say, I actually don't know everything.
absolutely. I think you're dead on. And like my reaction to that would be like, where I really get into trouble is the places where I simply can't know. Like there are certain things that are unknowable to me, whether that is because of the limits of my faculties or because of the circumstances that I grew up in. There's certain things that I cannot know. And like, I'm somebody who's always felt like my greatest value is in my rationality. Like and I feel like I remain a humble person, but like that's where I find my strength. It's like being able to reason through things and understand a lot of things and know a lot of things that like that strength just falls apart when you start to be like, no, there's questions that won't be answered. You cannot know them. And there are experiences that are being talked about right now that you fundamentally cannot understand, and you have to shut up and listen. Like, and I'm okay with that part of it, but it's a painful ache when you're just like, I want so badly to have compassion in this moment or know that thing and be able to dig in, and you just cannot. Like,
Yeah.
and I
There's an element I think of trust. I think maybe that's what's lacking in the world is like there's not enough trust, there's not enough community, and like I think as I try to step back, because I think a lot of things now kind of make sense if you see them in larger trends, and maybe this is something that goes back to multiple generations ago, but the institutions that were trusted in the 40s, 50s, and 60s came under lots of scrutiny, and when you stop trusting them, then everything becomes like, I need to know more. I need to know more. I can't leave this as a blind spot because I don't trust you. And I find like with our kids, like they trust us enough to like, you don't have to explain everything, but actually we do. but I think there has to be an element. And I found like when I was in the Navy is like, the commanding officer of the ship is not going to tell you what everything, they're not going to justify everything. And sometimes you just have to trust it, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's dangerous, even if it's stupid, even if they actually are agreed to be incompetent by lots of your shipmates. You have to trust that this is going to work out okay, because you don't have the power, you don't have the knowledge, end of story, and you have to accept that. And I think in this day and age, there's almost like this demand for information, this demand for like, I need to know everything, and people are uncomfortable with that. I don't know.
I think that's very true. And you once again tapped on the stoicism thing. That's kind of like, control what you can control and recognize that like you have, virtue is enough. Like this sort of be driven by virtue, follow this virtue. And But that leads me to the kind of question of like, um, so much of the religiosity debate to me is this idea that like that serves a very important social function, religious systems. And so we've sort of cast that off in this moment. And that's okay. Like, I think what we're finding is like really rationality and science. And, maybe it's the institution, maybe it's whatever that we're sort of placing our trust into. And I'm not necessarily saying one's a right way, where a right place to put it and where's a wrong place. But when those things fall and that's where the trust was at, you have this sort of chaos inside. And like, we do not have a unified system of ethic, of virtue, of spirituality that's driving or informing us anymore. And so you're finding these clashes
Yeah.
in those terms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the other part of it though is that in some respects, like you're never going to know every. It's not only is it not impossible everything, but there really is no singular truth. Like everybody has their own view of things, and it's not necessarily like saying that there isn't any, I guess, principles that should be more or less universal in like being accepted. But even one of the most basic things like thou shalt not kill has 100 different exceptions, right? So like there's no hard and fast rule that's going to be that can be agreed upon like 100%. But everybody sees the world just a little bit differently, and I think that's also what the technology is foisting upon all of us, is just this idea that, wait a second, not only does my family not see the things the way I do, but no one sees things the way I do. And we're all going a bit crazy. Like, being like, what do you mean? Like, and there are communities that just live totally differently. Like, and that's, I think we're all kind of like, I don't know, like if I'm talking like as you as a singer, like taking children, it's like, hey guys, children, it's okay. Like we are we're tribes people used to dealing with a tribe of 200, and we now have 300 million voices in our heads. This is a hard time, but we're going to get through this.
Yeah. And
that's my song.
Yeah. And I love it. And we inevitably do. Like,
yeah.
And that's kind of what I think I was getting at was, at the end of the day, I've made this statement before where I just feel like at the end of the day, every song I write is a song for me. Deep down, I think I'm really trying to speak to something within me that needs that ease. Like I say children in the song, myself being a child in that context. Because that's what I needed. I needed to feel like there was some kind of context in which it sort of made sense, or there was some piece that I could hold on to that was things work out. They will work out. It will. I have to trust in the better angels, that the better angels will prevail. Like I'm yielding to that. And those better angels can take on a number of different forms. But it's just really tricky. And like we can find ourselves in so many different bubbles, and like, when you were talking, I was thinking about like this realization I had a couple years ago where I would just get myself so tied up in knots. Like I'm somebody who is just constantly at war with like my rationality can look at this situation and like put off this very peaceful and like Zen approach to how I see life. And I think sometimes I do that, but I think deep down I'm somebody who suffers from anxiety and depression, and like my default settings are kind of at odds with how I can rationally see these things. And so like I would just constantly worry, oh, I had this conversation with somebody and what they looked away for 10 seconds, and like what did that mean? What did it say about me? And like there's certainly an egotism in that. But I just started to realize like I'm somebody who always like can assume the worst. Like the assumption is like, oh, you're assuming that everyone thinks differently than you. But like the reality is like, I've never given myself space or I've started to, I will give myself enough credit to say I'm working on getting to a place where I'm like, you have to recognize that, yeah, people can feel differently than you are. Like, and so I think a lot of the cultural strain right now is this like, oh, I believe this, but someone else believes this, so they must be bad. Like there must be a problem with the fact that they think differently than I do. But like, I was always on the opposite side. I was never able to recognize that other people felt the same way as I did. Like that, oh, they might have anxiety and depression too. They may be struggling with all these different things. And so that was a real roundabout way of getting to that. But it's just, we're all human beings, and if I'm approaching everyone in my life and the world with like the understanding that they have the same capacity as a human being towards, anxiety, depression, joy, happiness, the need for desire, the need for fulfillment, like it puts me right sized like that. And that's all I'm trying to do, is always get to that place of like humility, which was the word, you brought up. Uh, and it's like one of the great lessons I learned when I was getting sober was, humility is a spectrum. Like I've always been someone who was raised with this sort of Midwestern stoic, like to be proud of yourself, to present yourself as someone that's good at things, to, be excited and sell yourself. Like that is the same thing as arrogance. That is immodesty. And so you just always tap down that self-love thing because you can't come off as that arrogant brute. But then I realized through my program of recovery, like it works both ways. Like humility is not just coming down from above to this place of being humbled. It's coming from below to equal as well. And, if you're down here, because it's a spectrum, like it's really kind of operating on both sides. Like the most piteous person on earth, like I'm the worst possible person ever, like that voice, like that, there's an egotism to that. I'm the only one like this. And so like, as I've started to try and close that gap and get to that place of saying, no, everybody is doing the best that they can. You are absolutely allowed to love yourself. You ought to. Everyone should be loving themselves as well, and recognize that. It just is a much peaceful way of being. It's just constantly a dance of, it feels like, of trying to like stay balanced on that on that pedestal of understanding. But that's my sorry.
Yeah, no, no, and I think the idea of balance is it's actually, if you think about if you put a board on a little, like a roller or something, and you tried to stay balanced on it, it's really hard, right? It's a lot easier just to kind of lean one way and just stay there, or lean the other, and that way, balance which is I think what we all need, requires constant vigilance and constant awareness and constant engagement, and it's the harder thing to do, but it's I think the far healthier thing to do.
Definitely. And constant forgiveness for the fact that we're all trying to stay balanced on this. Like,
yeah,
it's okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So how did a boy from, you said, Southern Illinois make his way down to Nashville? Was it for school?
Yeah. So my parents and I'm from right outside St. Louis, farm towns. When I'm down here, I tell everybody I'm from St. Louis because if you say Illinois, they immediately think Chicago. Which was not my experience. I'm like small town farms living in the shadow of the metropolis type of experience. And
is that most of Illinois? Like, is it like kind of Chicago, and then the rest of it is kind of more small town?
Yeah, almost exclusively. Like there's some larger towns in there, but Chicago's massive, and it's just completely different. And I like Chicago as a town. Like I like visiting once in a while, but I do have a certain resentment, I think, towards it just because it like speaks for the state, and which I think probably every state feels that way. You live in outside.
Yeah, I live in New York City. So
in New York City.
I'm sure people feel that way about us.
Yeah. And it's fine. Like it's a playful resentment, but it's, we visited Nashville a couple times and, just to visit kind of the country music thing, because I was just on fire for music. And, I ended up attending Belmont University, which was a big step for me because I'd never been away from home really. And I was going to study music business. The two schools I was going to apply to were NYU and Belmont, to do music business. But Nashville was just much closer to home. But then it was sort of like I talked to my girlfriend at the time and, different people, and it was like that practicality was trying to win out and saying, oh, do music business. And finally, one of my music teachers just said, look, you're not going to be happy on the outskirts of music business. Like you're telling yourself that it's a more practical decision to do it that way. But if you're going to go and do it, you need to go and do it. And so I ended up trying out for the music program and got in, and that was its own experience. But that I ended up in Nashville then and stayed there. St. Louis has always felt more like home to me, but it's not very far from here. And it's also the music scene, the opportunity is just not the same as it is in Nashville. You know, admittedly, there's few places where it's the same as in Nashville, New York City, LA, kind of, but those types of things. But so I've stuck, but been here a decade now, 12 years, I guess.
Wow. And is it I guess like I don't know how big Nashville is people wise, but like is it just like do you just run into musicians all over the place? Like what is that like investment
Yeah.
bankers in New York City or something?
Yeah, it's changing a little bit. Nashville's growing at just a remarkable clip, which is a little frustrating, I think, because you're seeing it play out in like rents going up and traffic log jams because the infrastructure is not there yet to support the influx. And then you're seeing some of the venues closing down because you're like a lot of the people that are coming in are like Chicagoans or people from LA. And so their view of like the type of bar they want to go to is something a lot more cosmopolitan than this like dinky shack that is historically extremely significant. And so they've shut down a couple of those, which has just been a travesty because it's like you just shut down the venue where like here's every single person you could ever name played there prior to taking off. And so it's a historic landmark. And so that's starting to balance itself out. But in terms of like how many musicians are here, yeah, everyone plays music. And it's held its own lessons. Like as somebody who's always, as I said before, like tried to be modest and had trouble like marketing himself because he feels as if it's being arrogant to do so. Like you have to, like you just have to. If you come at it in this city and you present yourself as someone who doesn't care about what you're selling or doesn't believe in what it is you have, why should anybody else? Because there's 25 people standing right behind you that would be happy to brag on themselves. It makes it tough in logistical ways in terms of like, you don't make a whole lot of money playing here because everyone's doing it. Like it's such a saturated market that if I go to a bar and say, oh, I'd like $100 to play, they'll say, well, that's okay. We have 50 people who do it for free. Like, and so that kind of, which I don't blame the venues necessarily for that, but it's, everybody does it. You know, everybody, you have to learn how to specialize. You have to learn how to figure out what your strengths are and lean into them and ideally develop some more strengths that make you a valuable individual. You know, I know people who like are handymen, one of my good friends, and he can fix anything. And so he's constantly going around renovating people's houses in exchange for studio time and stuff like that. And so just figuring out what your strengths are and how you can use those to barter your way through this whole thing. But yeah.
Yeah. This might be a very ignorant question, but like when I hear Nashville, I think of like country music. You said you're more of a folk musician. Like what is the difference? How would you describe the difference between the country music and folk music?
I actually used to write for Scenes Media. It was like an online media source. I was a journalist, and they made me write an article on the difference between folk and country. And so I will send that to you eventually. But it's been a couple of years. But it's like you really have to think about. I think of them very similar. I describe them in that article as sister genres because you can look back at the history of it. And I think to some extent, kind of the country approach is a more regional thing, like historically speaking. A lot of what we now define as folk music was kind of born out of what was happening in the Northeast and the North. And certainly there was folk happening in the South, especially in Texas. And then country was much more happening in kind of the South and that sort of region. In terms of sound, country has less of a constant desire to remain traditional that folk does. You know, what you hear on the radio now with country is like, it's not my favorite stuff ever, but it sounds like 70s rock, really. Like that's what's happening. But what bothers me is that country music is one of the great American art forms. I mean, even if you aren't a country fan, like, and I love old country now because my parents loved it. It was never the thing I went to first. But I mean, you're talking about like American tributaries. Like, here's like a collection of songs from just amazing, like humble beginning, struggle out of the, like, that is the American consciousness. And it was happening in the other roots forms too, blues and jazz and folk. Like, they're all roots. And I just feel like we've lost that to some extent in country. It the country, like the classic saying, is like three chords and the truth. Like, that's what it is. It tends to be kind of a music that is played by amateur musicians who are singing their heart out and like putting down on paper like the blood that they're spilling outside in their own life, and folk, I think, still does that to some extent. Folk is kind of moving in its own direction. But what's happening with folk in the root forms is that there's this new term that they're using called Americana, and that's becoming kind of like the alternative rock of the root genres, where like it's just catching everything, and so it's just anything that is remotely sort of blues based or like roots country based or folk or any of those, and it can be cool, but because that is becoming sort of a crowded space, it's I'm having to think harder about sort of, what is it that I do, like, and I'd be the first person to say, like, just create what feels right to you. Like, don't care about the genre that it falls into. Figure it out. I mean, every record I've ever put out, there's these two radio stations in Nashville that I always want to play my music, and one of them's like the local independent rock level, and then the other is the Americana station. And like every single record ever I put out, I send it to the rock station, and they say it's too Americana, and then you send it to the Americana station, they say it's too rock. Like, and the Americana station now plays it. They're great, and I like all the people there. It's not that, but it's like I'm always reminded of like how silly the genre categorization is in not just music and everything, but the roundabout way of saying, like, Nashville is a lot more than just its country, but the country sensibility that is that truth telling, that heart, that kind of rootsy human experience thing, it exists still, and it's not that different from what's building folk up either. It just, again, as I recall in that article, it came down to like sort of the regionality of it to some extent. And country was, at the time, like, because of its regionality, it tended to be a less diverse cast of characters that played in it. And that would be, a little bit untrue. I mean, it's certainly like there were a lot of very progressive women voices, not progressive in terms of political ideology, but like the strength that they had and the success that they had at the time that they had was very progressive, and certainly there were black artists, and certainly the music was being inspired by Latin music, or Mexican music, mariachi music and stuff was showing up. But I think folk tended to be a little bit more like unapologetically diverse, and country kind of like against what all odds allowed for this sort of progress. But I would recommend Ken Burns's country music documentary if you haven't watched those. It is unbelievable. I mean, you get to the end of that, and at least for me, I had a totally different take on the whole thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful genre. But yeah, I feel like I'm getting on these like tangents and then just running and coming back. So
it's really interesting. Do you find have the last 6 years, 7 years in the country, has that influenced the music scene a lot? Are there people thinking about America and like in a new way, and expressing it in their art?
I think you're seeing it in Nashville. You're seeing a very, like, beyond just what's being created, you're seeing a very concerted effort to be representative and amplify voices. So you'll see a lot of sort of like there's a touring act now called the Black Opry, I think is what they call themselves. And so it's like country singers who are all black. And it's amazing. Like it's really a fabulous thing because it, like the Opry, you know, you think about it, and certainly there are African American and people of color who perform the Opry, but country still kind of remains synonymous with, you know, some of the other side of things. And so you're seeing a lot more concerted effort, I think, in trying to really lift that up. Like there's still constantly like all women uh, concerts that are being put together, and like, and so I think that's a cool thing. Uh, I think that that's good. Certainly among kind of the scene that I'm in, which is Nashville music, original music side, like you're seeing a lot of kind of that discontent with what's going on in the country right now, without going much into it, obviously. And that is showing up. Like there is this discontent, but you know what I think's really complicated is just again like that constant question of like, what is something that's okay for me to talk about? You know, where do you find that place to stand if you are a cis white male, like in this like situation, like, and that's something we all have to ask ourselves. You know, the cis white male is, you know, presumably just kind of that like, you know, I feel a lot of discontent about this. I feel really upset about this particular issue that may be coming up. And like, I want to be supportive of those around me who maybe that issue hits a lot closer to home than it does for me. But like, at what point, like, where do I take ownership of the issue, and in a way that I can speak about it? And in what places can I say, I shouldn't sing about that. I need to take a step back and allow that to be something that's told by somebody whose experience much more can speak to that discontent. And I think you're seeing a lot of that in the circles. Yeah, it feels, which I think is in some ways good. Like, I think it shows that people are being introspective and serious about how they approach it. I've not seen a lot of like pandering to an issue. Like you're not, which is good. I would not like to see a bunch of these sort of populist driven songs that are, oh, you know, this would sell right now. I'm not seeing that. Um, and I hope that that means it's because I surround myself with like people who are good artists and take it seriously. And I think that is what's the case, but it's just constantly that. Like, I know a lot of folks who like approach it in their own way. Like, you know, take ownership of like the America to you. Like, what is America to you? Like, I think what's kind of a struggle too is like, at what point can you stop and say like, this is an aspect of America that I appreciate? Like, I think that that's kind of what your podcast does, is like, it's almost as if like it's not popular to be pro-American. Like it just, in my circles, it's not
Yeah,
popular.
no, yeah,
Like,
but you know, but I think it's like, you know, we've always. I think that in some respect, there's the look back at history is both like it's also like people I can almost like be self-loathing or we're self-glorifying, and like in some, and it's not either. It's just like everything else we're talking about, which is like it's not black, it's not white. I mean, it is, there's gray, and it's not perfect. You look back, there wasn't the unity people think there was, and it wasn't the idealistic time that people think it was, but it also wasn't the horrible time. It's like it's everything, right? It's everything and it's nothing. And I think, like, to me, there is that this idea of like perspectives and realizing that I think we are like, we're all now being watched by cameras, not like in a Big Brother sense, but whenever we speak out, right, we're putting this out there. You and I having this conversation that's going to be available for public consumption, and usually we would just do this by ourselves, and we're doing this. At least I try to do it because I want other people to learn and also just kind of see that these kind of conversations can happen, and like talking about, you know, I guess the new voices that are coming into the country and into just participating in all the different segments of society more than it was before. You know, one of the things that you kind of referred to, I always try to say is like, look, I'm an able-bodied white Christian raised. I'm not practicing now, but heterosexual, like male, white male. That's my view, and I can't help but have that inform the way I see things. But that also means that everybody else has that view from their perspective. And I think one of the things when you're talking about like black artists in country or women in country, and I can almost understand some of those people rolling their eyes where it's like, why do we have to keep talking about this or talking about that? But then like I think you have to check yourself by saying, like, if you're a white man, you can look at any profession, anything, anywhere, and in the United States, a white man has done it. So you don't know what it's like to aspire to do a job where no one's ever done it before. I mean, it's hard enough as a white man to want to be a partner at a law firm in New York City, right? Imagine being, a black man. Imagine being a black, LGBTQ woman. Like it becomes only more difficult, and you have to be both sympathetic with that while still trying to address like what are the universalities that we all can agree upon, but understanding that there are all these different perspectives. And to me, it's harder, right? Because now you're looking at like I can't look at the superficial things that help me assess a person's quality or character. I actually have to do some heavy lifting here and actually decide what matters. And that works both ways. It's not just like for white men or institutions, but we all have to kind of think about like what kind of person do I want to deal with. And I think that's something that's always going to be in play. But I think it is healthier. And I think that I read this thing about humans, and one of the reasons why we have brains is because we had to coexist and work together in communities with other humans. And now our brain, again, like you said before, is going from dealing with a tribe of 200 to a tribe of 200 million. And it's going to require our brains to be doing the kind of mental gymnastics that we've never done before. And Google ain't going to fix that. Facebook's not going to fix that. There's no algorithm. It's going to require each of us to have more limber brains that can kind of shift from one perspective to another, one truth to another, try to find what is the overlapping things we can agree on, and what are the things we don't have to agree on. I don't know. It's crazy, but I think it's exciting that we're being challenged to do this next level of consciousness in some respects.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant way of looking at it. And I love that you approach it with an excitement, like, because that's what I'm trying to do too. And for my own personal good, because it's so much easier for me to like look at it from the other side and just feel overwhelmed and oh no, like the world's going off a cliff kind of moment. But it's just I think that's absolutely right. It's like taking ownership of kind of what is my experience, and like don't apologize for that experience, but be willing to use that experience to better serve the humans around you, like to better understand, to better love, to better have compassion for, and to better support and exalt, like in the moments when that needs to happen. And I think that's what I try to do in everything. And, the thing that always gets me is like, I always have to like approach it from a very local perspective, because it's so easy in this day and age to just see it like, oh, well, kindness like is something that we type about on Facebook. But like, I dislike when it's people I meet, or even moments when I guess I've been this way, is like, the humanist online who is a jerk to the people around them. Like, oh, it's so easy to be a humanist and portray yourself that way. But if you aren't kind to those who are in your immediate vicinity, like, what are you doing? That's not humanism. And so I think because we have this forced kind of massive tribe that you say, which I think is correct, like it's also important for me to just try and forcefully like enclose that and just be like, no, your experience absolutely you can exist here, but you have to exist here too. Like you have to recognize that like that 12 people in your circle, that's important, because that's where you're growing. That's where you can actually put into action these things.
Yeah.
Sending $10 a certain way, like, yeah, that's great. Do what you got to do. Like however you want to help. But, also be willing to do more than that. Like if I don't know. I think you're right. Is I guess what I would say. I think you're correct.
Yeah, no. All right. Well, I mean, I think we've solved some of the problems of the world as we approach the hour mark here. But I guess I like to wrap these interviews up with just a question about like what gives you hope at the end of the day.
What gives me hope? Uh, what gives me hope, I think, is I like, I've always been somebody who's been attracted to people who, against all odds, seem to succeed at what they're doing because they work hard. And so I'm going to take it back into the very local and say, like, my girlfriend, we met down here. We've been together for 5 years. Her name's Al. She sings on my most recent record on Good Good Love, and a lot of those tunes were about her. And we're from basically the same place in Southern Illinois. And so we actually met down here in kind of one of those weird cosmic coincidence types things. But like, she's going through school now and like working really hard, and is somebody who has not had anything handed to her in her life, has had some pretty harrowing experiences, and um, but she's like gotten to go back to college, and the state is paying for it because they have a program set up that like lets people who are older go back to school. And so she's been doing that and doing really well, and she's about to get her associates and go on to be to get her bachelor's and become a third grade teacher. And so I guess I would say, like, what gives me hope is knowing that that's possible. Uh, because in a lot of ways, because of systems that we have set up that exist, the idea of a state that like will help pay for the college, and like, and then also that she will get to teach, and she'll be somebody who has perspective and like recognizes that what's equally important in education beyond just the knowledge is like growth and acceptance and feeling safe and welcomed. And so that gives me a lot of hope. Which is, I guess, kind of an odd answer to that. But I just have hope because I think that what we're going through right now is something that has been gone through a number of times. But I think we're farther along the spectrum towards progress, the never ending journey, than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. At least I feel that way. But we still certainly have a lot of ways to go. And I just have hope that when the time comes, like the braver angels of our nature, and as the generation older than us, the boomer generation starts to continue to get older, and that torch inevitably gets handed, like, I think that things will take care of themselves. I just think we're in a tumultuous and tense time, and the statement that they will take care of themselves is not an excuse towards inaction or idleness in terms of continuing to love and to grow. But I think in the context of the great narrative, we're okay, and we're going to be okay. And I think you doing your podcast gives me hope because it shows me that the braver angels and rationality and compassion and humility are prevailing in small ways. And as they continue to, that will grow. I don't know.
Well, thank you. And your song and discovering your song, I think, was for me that sign of hope. And I think that it's a reminder to me that if you look for the angels, if you look for the hope, you'll find it. And I do mean that with all sincerity, which is why I reached out to you. I mean, I think your song was a beautiful song and a realistic song. I think there's something we don't want to have people talk blindly about how great things are, because they're not, but they're also not bad. It's a mixed bag, and we all want to bend that arc of progress. And that arc of progress is not a direct line. It's not going up all the way, and it's going to have down bits, and it's also but we'll get it there. But it's not going to be perfect, and we're never going to be perfect. And I like to remind people, the Constitution doesn't promise you a perfect union; it promises you a more perfect union. And I think in that opening, it's acknowledging that we are not divine, and we will never have a perfect union. We're just always. I think what our country gives us is the power to make it more perfect and make our lives more perfect.
Yeah.
And
I love that.
So thank you for your inspirational song to help me kind of keep hopeful for that. So
thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad we've got this connection. And I hope, someday soon I can make my way down to Nashville.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure I'll be here. So.
All right. And come on up to New York.
Okay. I will.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.